Think you know the Wild West from the movies? Think again. The silver screen gave us heroes in white hats and villains in black, but it scrubbed away the filth and the blood. The reality was far more terrifying. We're about to journey back to an era where a man's life was worth less than the horse he rode, and justice was often found at the bottom of a whiskey bottle or the barrel of a gun. Forget the legends. It's time to meet the monsters. Welcome, everyone, to Life Wild West. We're about to unearth the chilling truths behind the most savage outlaws to ever roam the American frontier. If you're fascinated by the raw, untamed history that Hollywood was too afraid to show, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because you've just found your home. Today we're counting down the top 10 deadliest outlaws, starting with the dangerous and working our way to the absolute most lethal. Let's start with number 10, Clay Allison. Clay Allison wasn't just an outlaw. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of violence and pure, unadulterated chaos. Born in Tennessee in 1840, Allison served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, but he was discharged for a psychiatric condition described as partly epileptic and partly maniacal. This diagnosis would prove to be a terrifying understatement for the rest of his life. His reputation for being wildly unpredictable and extremely violent wasn't just earned. It was seared into the memory of everyone who crossed his path. A prime example of his madness took place in 1870. A man named Charles Kennedy was locked up in the local jail, convicted of murdering several travelers, and there were even whispers of cannibalism. For most people, knowing a killer was behind bars would be enough, but not for Clay Allison. He decided the legal system was too slow and too merciful. He led an angry mob, stormed the jail, dragged Kennedy from his cell, and personally lynched him from a telegraph pole. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy Allison's peculiar brand of justice. As Kennedy's body swung lifelessly, Allison, in a final act of grotesque spectacle, decapitated the man. He then took the severed head, impaled it on a stake, and proudly mounted it above the entrance of his favorite saloon in Elizabethtown, New Mexico. Imagine the horror of local families and their children coming in for a sarsaparilla, only to be greeted by the decaying head of a murderer. Allison's eccentricities didn't stop at vigilante justice. He was infamous for riding his horse through the center of town, stark naked with nothing but a holster and his trusted pistol strapped to his hip. He was a man who lived without rules and seemed to delight in shocking the sensibilities of civilized society. He was also known to get into duels with his own reflection in mirrors after a long night of drinking, often shooting them to pieces. But perhaps the most telling story, the one that perfectly captures his cold-blooded nerve and dark humor, was his dinner with a rival gunfighter named Chunk Colbert. Colbert was a dangerous man himself, with a reputation for having killed at least 7 men. It was an open secret in the territory that Colbert was itching to add Clay Allison's name to his list. Everyone knew he wanted Allison dead. So when Colbert invited Allison to dinner, everyone expected Allison to decline, or to set an ambush of his own. Instead, Allison calmly accepted the invitation. The two men sat across from each other at a small table in a crowded inn, sharing a meal. The tension must have been thick enough to cut with a knife. Midway through the dinner, Colbert made his move. He suddenly lunged for his pistol, intending to shoot Allison dead where he sat. But in his haste, Colbert's gun barrel struck the edge of the dinner table, throwing off his aim for a split second. That split second was all Clay Allison needed. In a single fluid motion, Allison drew his own revolver and fired a single shot, striking Colbert directly between the eyes. He fell back, dead, instantly. When the shocked townspeople later asked Allison why on earth he would risk his life by accepting dinner with a man he knew was planning to kill him, Allison's reply became legendary. He calmly wiped his mouth and said, "Because I didn't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach." Coming in at number 9. Cherokee Bill. His real name was Crawford Goldsby, but the world would come to know and fear him as Cherokee Bill. This infamous outlaw was a one-man crime wave, responsible for the deaths of anywhere from 8 to 13 people in a spree that was as brief as it was bloody. Born with a mix of Cherokee, black, and white heritage, he was an outsider from the start, a man who never quite fit into the rigid social structures of the late 19th century. His journey into lawlessness began in 1894, at the tender age of 18. His older brother had been badly beaten by a man named Jake Lewis. Young Goldsby, filled with rage, decided to confront Lewis. But when he stood face to face with the man, he realized he didn't want to risk getting a beating himself, so he chose a more permanent solution. He drew a pistol and shot Lewis dead. From that moment on, Crawford Goldsby ceased to exist, and Cherokee Bill, the wanted fugitive, was born. He didn't stay a lone wolf for long. Shortly after the killing, he joined the notorious Cook Gang, a brutal outfit led by Bill Cook that specialized in robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains across the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. They were ruthless and efficient, and with Cherokee Bill in their ranks, they became even more dangerous. His time with the gang was a blur of violent crime. To truly understand this man's insane and relentless capacity for violence, you don't need to look at his entire criminal career. Just a small, bloody slice of the summer of 1894 tells the whole story. On June 17th, Bill shot and killed Deputy Sheriff Sequoia Houston during a fierce gunfight. Just 1 month later, on the 4th of July, while the rest of the country celebrated its independence, Cherokee Bill celebrated by shooting and killing 2 more men. As if that wasn't enough, just 2 days later, on July 6th, he was rumored to have murdered a railroad worker who got in his way. Then, a few weeks later, on July 30th, he and the Cook Gang hit the Lincoln County Bank, leaving a trail of terror in their wake. This relentless pace of robbery and murder continued until his luck finally ran out. He was captured on January 31st, 1895 by Deputy U.S. Marshals, but even being locked in a federal jail couldn't contain the violence within Cherokee Bill. While awaiting trial, he somehow got his hands on a smuggled revolver. In a desperate escape attempt, he got into a shootout with the guards, killing one of them, Larry Keating, by shooting him in the stomach and back. The escape ultimately failed, and he was quickly locked back in his cell, now with another murder charge hanging over his head. His day of reckoning came on March 17, 1896. As he stood on the gallows, the infamous outlaw, whose name had terrorized the territory, was asked if he had any last words. The crowd waited, expecting a speech, a confession, or perhaps some sign of remorse. Instead, Cherokee Bill, with his signature silver-toothed grin, looked out at the spectators and said flatly, "I came here to die, not make a speech." A chilling end for a man who lived and died by the gun. At number 8, we have George Parrott. The Wild West was filled with outlaws who had some of the coolest, most intimidating nicknames imaginable. Names like Wild Bill Hickok, Pistol Pete, and Billy the Butcher. These names struck fear into the hearts of lawmen and civilians alike. And then there was George Parrott. Sadly for him, he got stuck with one of the most unfortunate nicknames in outlaw history, Big Nose George, or sometimes Big Beak Parrott. With a nickname like that, it's perhaps no surprise the man was perpetually angry and channeled that rage into a life of crime. Big Nose George was a cattle rustler, a highwayman, and a train robber, but his most infamous crime was cold-blooded murder. For years, he and his gang terrorized the territories of Wyoming and Montana, leaving a trail of robbed stagecoaches and stolen livestock. His reign of crime came to a screeching halt in August of 1878. Big Nose George and his gang had a plan to derail a Union Pacific train near Medicine Bow, Wyoming, by pulling a spike from the tracks. They figured they could rob the payroll car in the ensuing chaos. But as they worked to pry the spike loose, they were spotted by a railroad section foreman. Realizing their plan was foiled, they fled, making their way to a hideout in Rattlesnake Canyon. What they didn't know was that 2 lawmen, a deputy sheriff from Carbon County named Robert Widowfield, and a Union Pacific detective named Tip Vincent, were hot on their trail. These weren't ordinary lawmen, they were expert trackers. They followed the faint hoofprints left by the gang's horses all the way to the canyon, but the gang had spotted them coming. As the lawmen entered the canyon, they were ambushed and murdered in cold blood. The killings sparked outrage. A massive bounty of $20,000 was placed on George's head. an astronomical sum for the time, equivalent to over $600,000 today. The pressure was on, but George managed to evade capture until 1880, when he was finally arrested in Montana after getting drunk and bragging about the murders. He was brought back to Wyoming to stand trial. Once in jail, things took an even more shocking turn. George, using a simple pocket knife, managed to saw through his shackles. He then used the heavy iron cuffs to brutally beat the jailer, fracturing his skull. He almost made it out, but he was confronted by the jailer's furious wife, who held him at gunpoint until help arrived. News of his violent escape attempt spread through the town like wildfire. The citizens decided they weren't going to wait for a trial. A lynch mob of around 200 angry people stormed the jail, dragged Big Nose George out, and threw a rope over the crossbeam of a telegraph pole. They lynched him right there in the street. But the story of Big Nose George doesn't end with his death. What happened next is one of the most grotesque and bizarre episodes in the history of the West. Two doctors, John Eugene Osborne and Thomas Maggie, took possession of his body for scientific study. They proceeded to make a death mask of his face, and then, in an act of pure macabre creativity, they skinned him. Osborne had George's skin tanned and used it to make a medical bag and a pair of shoes, which he actually wore on special occasions, including his inaugural ball when he later became governor of Wyoming. The top part of George's skull was given to Dr. Maggie's 15-year-old assistant, Lillian Heath, who used it as an ashtray and a doorstop for many years. Today, the skull fragments and the shoes made from his skin are on display at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming. It's a gruesome end, even for an outlaw. Which of these outlaws so far has the most bizarre story? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Sliding into the number 7 spot is Bill Doolin. Bill Doolin was a founder of the infamous Wild Bunch Gang, a group that terrorized the American West with a string of audacious robberies and murders. It's important not to confuse his gang with the later, more famous Wild Bunch, led by Butch Cassidy, who actually took inspiration from Doolin's crew. Doolin's gang, also known as the Doolin-Dalton Gang, carved out a bloody reputation primarily in Oklahoma and the Indian Territory from 1892 through 1896. This wasn't some petty gang of thieves. Under Doolin's leadership, the Wild Bunch quickly became one of the most powerful and feared criminal organizations in the country. They were experts at robbing banks and trains, and they were incredibly successful. It's estimated they amassed a fortune of around $165,000, which in today's money would be well over $5 million. To put that in perspective, depending on where you live, that's enough to buy a luxurious mansion or, a slightly used pickup truck with the way prices are going. Their success made them public enemy number 1. The states they operated in had no choice but to place enormous bounties on the heads of every single member. They were wanted dead or alive, and the lure of that reward money attracted some of the toughest lawmen and bounty hunters in the nation, known as the Three Guardsmen: Bill Tillman, Heck Thomas, and Chris Madsen. A relentless manhunt began. By 1895, the pressure was taking its toll. The gang began to fall apart as its members were picked off one by one in bloody shootouts. Bill Doolin himself was finally captured by the legendary lawman Bill Tilghman in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, on January 15, 1896. He was jailed, and it seemed his reign of terror was finally over. But Doolin wasn't one to sit in a cell. Just 6 months into his sentence, on July 5th, he and several other inmates staged a daring escape. He somehow got his hands on a revolver, held up a guard, and forced him to unlock the jail doors. Doolin was free again, and another massive manhunt ensued. This time, however, his freedom would be short-lived. A posse led by Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas tracked him to a farmhouse in Lawson, Oklahoma. As night fell on August 24, 1896, the lawmen surrounded the property. They ordered him to come out peacefully and surrender. A few tense moments passed. Then the farmhouse door creaked open and Bill Doolin walked out into the moonlight. But he wasn't surrendering. He emerged with his rifle blazing, firing at the shadowy figures that surrounded him. It was a foolish, desperate act. The instant he opened fire, Heck Thomas unleashed a blast from his shotgun. Doolin was hit by 20 pellets and fell to the ground, dead. It turns out that trying to take on a posse of 20 heavily armed lawmen by yourself is, and always will be, a terrible idea. At number 6, we find a man of chilling duality, Jim Miller. James Brown Miller, known by the terrifyingly accurate nicknames Deacon Jim, Killing Jim, or simply Killer Miller, was an outlaw, a professional assassin, and, for a time, a lawman. He is widely considered one of the most cold-blooded and prolific killers of the entire Wild West era. Miller often wore a long black frock coat, regardless of the weather, partly to conceal the steel plate he wore under his shirt as a form of body armor, which saved his life on multiple occasions. He was a devout Methodist who never smoked or drank, and was known for quoting the Bible, earning him the name Deacon Jim. But this pious exterior concealed a heart of pure ice. Officially, it's estimated that he killed a minimum of 12 men. However, Miller himself, in what can only be described as some genius, twisted marketing for his services, claimed the number was closer to 50. Some of these killings could be seen as justified, committed in the line of duty during his early career as a town marshal in Pecos, Texas. He was known for being quick on the draw and ruthlessly efficient at taming the town. But the vast majority of his victims were not criminals. They were simply unlucky souls whose deaths were purchased by Miller's clients. He eventually shed the pretense of law and order and became a full-time professional hitman. His standard fee was $150 per kill, which is about $5,000 in today's money. For years, he operated as a killer for hire, his services contracted by wealthy cattlemen, bitter rivals, and anyone with a grudge and enough cash. One of his most famous alleged hits was the assassination of the legendary lawman Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid, though Miller was acquitted of that crime. His final contract came in 1908. He was hired by 3 wealthy Oklahoma ranchers, Jesse West, Joe Allen, and Barry Burrell, to murder a former deputy U.S. Marshal named Allen Augustus Gus Bobbitt. Bobbitt was a rancher and land speculator, and the 3 men wanted his valuable land. The plan was simple: pay Jim Miller $1,700 to eliminate Bobbitt, after which they would swoop in and acquire his property. The following day, Miller carried out the hit with his typical ruthless efficiency. He ambushed Bobbitt on his own property, hidden in the brush near a gate. As Bobbitt rode through, Miller opened fire with a shotgun, blasting him from his horse. As Bobbitt lay dying on the ground, his wife ran to the scene. With his final gasping breaths, he managed to utter the name of his killer, Jim Miller. That dying declaration was all the law needed. Soon, Miller and the 3 men who hired him were captured and arrested. They were taken to the county jail in Ada, Oklahoma, to await trial. But word quickly spread through the town that the men had hired the best lawyers money could buy, and there might not be enough hard evidence to convict them. The townspeople, fearing these cold-blooded killers would walk free, decided to take justice into their own hands. On the night of April 19, 1909, a large mob broke into the jail, overpowered the guards, and dragged all 4 men out of their cells. They were taken to a nearby livery stable. Ropes were thrown over the rafters, and nooses were placed around their necks. As the other 3 men cried, prayed, and begged for their lives, Jim Miller remained eerily calm. He showed no fear, no emotion. His only request was to be allowed to wear his black hat as he died. In his final moments, looking at the lynch mob, he showed his true defiant nature. He yelled, "Let her rip!" and voluntarily stepped off the box he was standing on, hanging himself. He was a professional killer who met his end at the hands of vigilantes. These tales from the Wild West are just unbelievable. If you're enjoying this journey into the past, do me a favor and hit that like button to let me know. Halfway through our list, at number 5, is Sam Bass. Sam Bass was an infamous train robber from Indiana who became the leader of the notorious Sam Bass Gang. This gang would etch their name into American history by pulling off what was, at the time, the single largest train robbery the nation had ever seen. But before he became a legendary outlaw, Sam Bass actually tried to live an honest life. Believe it or not, he wasn't born a criminal. He worked a variety of legitimate jobs. He was a farmhand, a teamster, and a cattle wrangler on the long drives from Texas to Kansas. He even, at one point, worked for the local sheriff and tried his hand at horse racing. Sam could have very well continued down this straight and narrow path if it weren't for one crippling weakness, a severe gambling addiction. He accumulated enormous debts that he simply couldn't pay off, and the mounting pressure pushed him into a life of crime. He started small, robbing stagecoaches, but he soon realized the real money was on the rails. He put together a gang and began to specialize in robbing trains. Using the inside knowledge he had gained from his time working around the railroads, he and his gang managed to successfully rob 4 consecutive trains outside of Dallas, Texas. They were becoming a serious problem for the authorities. But it was in 1877 that Sam Bass and his gang would pull off the heist of a lifetime. On September 18th, they targeted a Union Pacific passenger train in Big Springs, Nebraska. They captured the station master and forced him to signal the train to stop. Once aboard, they plundered the mail and baggage cars. At first, they were disappointed, finding only a few $1,000s. But then they discovered the express car's safe. After a tense standoff, they cracked it open and found an unbelievable treasure: $60,000 worth of freshly minted 1877 $20 gold pieces. In today's currency, that's a haul of nearly $2 million. This single robbery made them the most wanted men in America. Pinkerton agents and Texas Rangers were immediately on their trail. Realizing the immense heat that was now on them, the gang immediately split up, hoping to disappear with their newfound fortunes. But it wasn't meant to be. One by one, members of the gang were hunted down and either killed or captured. The following year, in 1878, Sam Bass must have grown tired of being a retired, wealthy outlaw. He put together a new gang and planned to get back into the game. On July 19th, they rode into Round Rock, Texas, with the intention of robbing the Williamson County Bank. But their plan was doomed from the start. Unbeknownst to Sam, one of his new gang members, a man named Jim Murphy, had turned informant and tipped off the Texas Rangers. As the gang scouted the bank, they were confronted by local deputies. A massive shootout erupted in the streets of Round Rock. Several of his gang members were shot and killed. Sam himself was badly wounded but managed to climb onto his horse and escape the town. The following day, a posse found him helpless and bleeding, lying in a pasture north of town. He had suffered a mortal bullet wound. They rushed him back to town, where he was interrogated by the Rangers, but he refused to name any of his accomplices. Sam Bass died the next day, on his 27th birthday. Now we enter the realm of the truly psychotic. At number 4, John Wesley Hardin. If the Wild West had a poster child for pure, unadulterated psychopathy, it would be John Wesley Hardin. He was not just a killer, he was a prodigy of violence, committing his first crime as a child when he stabbed a classmate after a schoolyard fight. This was just a dark preview of the man he would become. His descent into murder began in earnest in 1868, at the shockingly young age of 15. He got into an argument with a former slave named Mage. In Hardin's mind, the quickest way to win an argument was to eliminate the opposition. He shot and killed the man. This single act set him on a path from which he would never return. Fearing arrest by the Union soldiers who were occupying Texas during Reconstruction, he went on the run. When 3 of these soldiers tried to arrest him, he didn't surrender. He ambushed them, killing all 3. He was now a full-blown fugitive and a cop killer at just 15 years old. His most infamous period of bloodshed occurred in 1871 while he was working as a cowboy on a cattle drive up the famous Chisholm Trail. Along the way, he killed another 7 people in various altercations. In Abilene, Kansas, a notorious cattle town, he got into a confrontation with the legendary lawman Wild Bill Hickok, though both men backed down before it came to bloodshed. However, while staying in a local hotel, Hardin was woken up by the snoring of a man in the next room. Annoyed, he fired his pistols through the wall, killing the man instantly. Over the next few years, he added at least 4 more men to his gruesome tally. By 1878, the official count was that Hardin had killed at least 20 men, but many reports, including Hardin's own boasts, speculated the true number could be as high as 40. He was finally arrested after the murder of a deputy sheriff named Charles Webb in Brown County, Texas. Texas Rangers, led by the legendary John B. Armstrong, tracked him all the way to a train in Florida and captured him after a violent shootout. John Wesley Hardin was sentenced to 25 years in a Texas prison. In a strange twist, this remorseless killer spent the next 14 years of his life studying theology and law. He even wrote an autobiography, a self-serving account where he justified most of his killings as self-defense. After serving his time, he was released in 1894 and became a lawyer. His new life didn't last long. In 1895, in El Paso, Texas, Hardin's new girlfriend was arrested by a local constable, John Selman Jr., for illegally carrying a pistol. Hardin, whose violent temper had not mellowed with age, exploded with rage. He publicly threatened to kill the officer. A few hours later, Hardin was at the Acme Saloon, shooting dice. An off-duty lawman, John Selman Sr., the father of the constable Hardin had threatened, walked into the saloon, came up behind Hardin, and shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Selman simply did not want to take the chance of ending up on John Wesley Hardin's infamous death list. As for Selman, an El Paso jury would end up acquitting him for the murder, as they felt he had done the town a favor. A jury acquitted the officer, believing he'd done the town a favor. What do you think? Justice or just another murder? It's stories like these that make you question everything, and we've got plenty more to share, so be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Reaching the top 3, we have a name that is practically synonymous with the term outlaw. At number 3, Jesse James. Jesse James is perhaps the most famous, most mythologized outlaw in all of American history. But the romantic image of him as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, is a dangerous lie. The truth is that Jesse James was a product of war, a cold-blooded killer whose appetite for violence was forged in the crucible of the American Civil War. At the very young age of 16, he joined a ruthless pro-Confederate guerrilla group known as the Bushwhackers, led by the infamous William "Bloody Bill" Anderson. The Bushwhackers were not soldiers, they were terrorists. They waged a brutal campaign against Union soldiers and any civilians who supported them. To understand the man Jesse James became, you need to understand the atrocities he participated in as a boy. He took part in the Lawrence Massacre of 1863 in Kansas, where the Bushwhackers rode into the pro-Union town and systematically slaughtered over 150 unarmed men and boys. He was also present at the Centralia Massacre of 1864 in Missouri, where his group pulled 24 unarmed Union soldiers from a train, forced them to strip, and then executed them in cold blood. This was the world that shaped Jesse James. Violence was not just a tool for him, it was a way of life. After the Civil War ended, Jesse, his brother Frank, and other former Confederate guerrillas like the Younger Brothers found they couldn't or wouldn't readjust to civilian life. They took the skills they had learned in the war and applied them to a new kind of battle. They formed the James Younger Gang, which would soon become the most feared outlaw gang in American history. They began by robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches across the Midwest. What made them so feared was their utter ruthlessness. They never hesitated to kill anyone who got in their way: bank tellers, cashiers, brave citizens who tried to stop them, or innocent bystanders who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The James Younger Gang terrorized the United States for over a decade, from 1866 to 1876, robbing more than 20 banks and countless trains. The crazy part is that in Missouri, Jesse James and his gang were often treated like celebrities. Because they targeted banks and railroads, institutions often seen as Northern aggressors by defeated Confederates, a pro-Southern newspaper editor named John Newman Edwards began to portray them as heroes, modern-day knights fighting against tyranny. They were romanticized in dime novels and sensationalized in the press, which garnered them a ton of local support and sympathy. It actually got so out of hand that when the gang was rumored to be robbing a bank, crowds would sometimes gather from a safe distance, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous outlaws in action. But after 10 long years of crime, the gang's luck began to run out. In 1876, they attempted a disastrous raid on the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota. The brave townspeople fought back, killing or capturing most of the gang. Only Jesse and his brother Frank managed to escape. The James Younger gang was finished. Jesse tried to lay low, but the bounty on his head grew larger and larger. By 1882, he was living under an assumed name, paranoid and trusting no one. He asked 2 brothers, Robert and Charlie Ford, to move in with him and his family for protection. He thought he could trust them, as they had been recent recruits to his new, smaller gang. He was wrong. The Ford brothers had secretly made a deal with the governor of Missouri to kill Jesse in exchange for the bounty and a full pardon. On the morning of April 3, 1882, the weather was unusually warm. James removed his pistols, something he almost never did, and climbed onto a chair to dust and straighten a picture on his wall. As his back was turned, Robert Ford drew his pistol and shot Jesse James in the back of the head. The most famous outlaw in America was dead, not in a blaze of glory, but by the hand of a coward he had invited into his own home. The 2 brothers collected the reward money shortly after and were later pardoned for the murder. Our runner-up for the Deadliest Outlaw at number 2 is another legendary figure, Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, also known as William H. Bonney, but best known to the world as Billy the Kid, was an infamous outlaw and a deadly gunfighter whose legend has far outgrown the short, violent life he lived. His life took a dramatic turn in 1874, when he was just 15 years old. His mother, the only stable figure in his life, died of tuberculosis. His stepfather, wanting nothing to do with raising Billy and his brother, abandoned them, leaving the 2 boys as orphans in a harsh and unforgiving world. With no one to look after them, they were forced to steal food and clothing just to survive. Eventually, Billy was caught stealing from a Chinese laundry and was thrown into the local jail. It was his first real taste of the law, and he wanted no part of it. During the night, the small, wiry teenager managed to shimmy his way up the jailhouse chimney and escape. From that day until the day he died, Billy the Kid would remain a wanted fugitive. For the next few years, he drifted, joining various gangs of horse thieves and cattle rustlers, committing petty crimes and getting into scrapes. He was arrested several times, but always managed to escape. By the early 1870s, he seemed to be on the verge of settling down. He found honest work as a cowboy on a ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico, for an Englishman named John Tunstall. Tunstall was a kind, educated man who became a mentor and a father figure to the young outlaw. For the first time, Billy had found a home, but Lincoln County was a powder keg. It was controlled by a corrupt ring of businessmen led by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, who had a monopoly on all the goods and cattle contracts in the area. John Tunstall was their business rival, an honest man who threatened their corrupt empire. In February 1878, with the help of the Crooked Town Sheriff, William Brady, the Murphy-Dolan faction sent a posse to seize Tunstall's cattle. As Tunstall rode out to confront the men, he was ambushed. He was shot in the chest, knocked from his horse. As he lay helpless on the ground, one of the men walked over, took Tunstall's own pistol, and executed him with a shot to the back of the head. Little did these men know, by killing John Tunstall, they had all but sealed their own fates. They had unleashed the fury of Billy the Kid. This brutal murder marked the start of the bloody Lincoln County War. A group of Tunstall's ranch hands and supporters formed a vigilante posse called the Regulators. Their goal was simple. They swore to hunt down and kill every single man who took part in Tunstall's murder. Billy the Kid was one of their most prominent and deadliest members. It didn't take long for the Regulators to start getting their revenge. They tracked down and killed the 2 gunmen who had murdered Tunstall. Then on April 1, 1878, Billy and the Regulators ambushed Sheriff Brady and his deputies on the main street of Lincoln, killing them all in a hail of gunfire. The Lincoln County War raged for over a year with dozens of killings on both sides. After the war ended, a new governor issued pardons for most of the participants, but not for Billy the Kid. He was now a wanted man for the murder of the town's sheriff. In 1880, he was finally captured by his old acquaintance, Sheriff Pat Garrett, and put on trial. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang for his crimes, but Billy had other plans. On April 28, 1881, while being held at the Lincoln County Courthouse, he staged one of the most famous escapes in American history. He managed to slip out of his handcuffs, got into a fight with one of the guards, James Bell, stole his revolver, and shot him dead. Then, he grabbed a shotgun from the sheriff's office. As the second guard, Bob Ollinger, ran back from across the street to see what the commotion was, Billy leaned out of the second-story window. He taunted Ollinger, yelling, "Hello, Bob!" And when the guard looked up, Billy blasted him with both barrels of the shotgun. Billy the Kid had escaped from jail once again. A $500 reward was placed on his head. He was wanted dead or alive. Pat Garrett began to track him relentlessly. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett tracked him to a ranch at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Billy's luck had finally run out. Garrett crept into a darkened bedroom where Billy was staying. As Billy entered the room, he sensed someone was there and called out, "¿Quién es? Who is it?" Garrett recognized his voice, raised his pistol in the dark, and fired twice. A single bullet struck Billy the Kid in the chest, killing him almost instantly. He would go down in history as one of the most legendary figures of the Wild West, having allegedly killed 21 men, one for each year of his short life. And finally, at the number 1 spot, we have not one, but 2 outlaws who formed the most successful criminal partnership in the history of the American West, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh are 2 of the most famous outlaws to ever live, but most of the world will forever know them by their legendary nicknames. The reason they share the number 1 spot is because together, as the leaders of the Wild Bunch gang, they weren't just the most successful, they were the smartest. But before we talk about their incredible partnership, let's first cover the origins of the mastermind, Butch Cassidy. He would become the leader and founder of the Wild Bunch, a name he cleverly borrowed from Bill Doolin's earlier gang to cause confusion for the law. Butch began with petty crimes, stealing cattle and horses, but he quickly realized he was destined for bigger things. It was on June 24, 1889, that he cemented himself as one of the most brilliant criminal minds the world had ever seen. On that day, Butch and 3 accomplices robbed the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride, Colorado. They escaped with around $24,000, which is the equivalent of about $800,000 today. The reason a robbery this large was so flawlessly successful was thanks to Butch's meticulous, almost obsessive planning. For weeks beforehand, he scouted the town and the surrounding countryside, memorizing every street, alley, and escape route. He didn't just plan the getaway, he engineered it. He had custom-made leather bags crafted, reinforced to withstand the heavy weight of the stolen gold and cash. More importantly, he created a brilliant relay system for their escape. He had fresh horses stationed at several points along their planned escape route. This meant that as their horses grew tired, they could switch to fresh mounts, guaranteeing that any posse pursuing them on exhausted horses would never be able to keep up. Butch Cassidy simply left nothing to chance. It was these kinds of tactics that made Butch and his Wild Bunch gang, which included his famous partner, the fast-drawing Sundance Kid, so incredibly successful. For over a decade, they robbed a string of banks and trains across the West with unparalleled success. But what's truly shocking, and what sets them apart from nearly every other outlaw on this list, is that Butch Cassidy was known to have never personally killed anyone during these robberies. They used their brains and their reputation, not senseless violence. However, after a decade of high-profile crimes, the pressure from law enforcement, especially the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, became relentless. Their faces were on wanted posters everywhere. Realizing their time in America was running out, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Sundance's companion, Etta Place, fled the country. They made their way to Argentina and then to Bolivia, where they tried to live as honest ranchers. But old habits die hard. They eventually returned to robbing payrolls. And in November 1908, in the small mining town of San Vicente, Bolivia, they were allegedly cornered by a unit of Bolivian soldiers. A massive shootout ensued. When the guns fell silent, both outlaws were found dead inside. It was said they had been killed in the battle. That's the official story. But here's where the legend takes a fascinating turn. In the 1990s, forensic anthropologists exhumed the bodies from the graves that were supposed to hold the two famous outlaws. They attempted to match the DNA from the bones with DNA from their living relatives in the United States. But there was a problem. Neither of their DNA samples were a match. The men buried in those graves were not Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This has led to widespread speculation that both men survived that night in Bolivia. Some stories claim they faked their deaths and returned to the United States shortly after, living out the rest of their lives as wealthy, respectable men under new identities. They might not have been the most violent outlaws of the Wild West when it comes to kill counts. But as far as the banks, the railroads, and the US government were concerned, there never existed a more formidable, more brilliant, and more deadly effective gang than the Wild Bunch. From masterminds to psychopaths, the Wild West was filled with legends whose stories still echo today. Which outlaw's tale shocked you the most? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Wild West for more deep dives into the untamed history of the American frontier. Thanks for watching.